وأتشرف بإدارة هذه الجلسة ضمن مسار المصالحة الخليجية وتداعياتها. هذه الجلسة ستناقش آه، أثر المصالحة إفريقيا، وسيكون معنا اثنان من أساتذة العلوم السياسية العرب البارزين حقيقة، الدكتور حسن نافعة سيحدثنا، كلاهما سيكون عبر زوم. الدكتور حسن نافعة سيحدثنا من القاهرة، والدكتور حسن الحاج علي سيحدثنا من الخرطوم. والدكتور حسن سيحدثنا عن مصر والمصالحة الخليجية. مصر كانت طرفا في الأزمة كما هو معلوم، هي عنصر في الرباعي العربي، وكانت أيضا طرفا في الحل. يعني الدكتور حسن سيقدم قراءته وموقف مصر من الأزمة، والدكتور حسن الحاج علي سيتحدث عن أثر المصالحة في التنافسات الخليجية التي كانت قائمة أصلا في منطقة القرن الإفريقي. أبدأ مع الدكتور حسن، والحقيقة البحثان هما غنيان عن التعريف، لكنني سأقول دكتور حسن نافعة هو أستاذ العلوم السياسية والرئيس السابق لقسم العلوم السياسية بكلية الاقتصاد والعلوم السياسية بجامعة القاهرة. عمل أستاذا في العديد من الجامعات، وحاضر في عدد من المعاهد والجامعات، منها جامعة كارولاينا الشمالية وجامعة كولومبيا وجامعة ميريلاند في الولايات المتحدة وأكاديمية ناصر العسكرية والجامعة الأمريكية في القاهرة، وله العديد من الكتب والدراسات المنشورة في عدد من الدوريات العالمية والعربية المحكمة. من كتبه كتاب الاتحاد الأوروبي والدروس المستفادة عربيا صادر في 2004، وكتاب مصر والصراع العربي الإسرائيلي من الصراع المحتوم إلى التسوية المستحيلة، وهذا كتاب يعني مبكر صادر سنة 1984. الدكتور نافع كان من الذين تفاعلوا مع المركز العربي منذ بواكير تأسيسه، ونحن نسعد ونتشرف بأن يشارك معنا الدكتور نافع مجددا. أهلا وسهلا بك دكتور حسن في منتدى دراسات الخليج. لك الكلمة الآن. عنوان ورقتك مصر والمصالحة الخليجية، الآفاق والانعكاسات، ولك 20 دقيقة. تفضل دكتور.
صباح الخير جميعا. شكرا سيادة الرئيس، والشكر موصول أيضا للمركز العربي للأبحاث ودراسة السياسات، وأيضا لمنتدى دراسات الخليج. وكان يسعدني طبعا أن أتفاعل معكم مباشرة في الدوحة، ولكن هذا كان بالنسبة لي مسألة غير ممكنة، لكن حسن الحظ يعني أن تتاح لي هذه الفرصة للتفاعل عبر وسائل التواصل الحديثة مع إخوة أعزاء وباحثين مرموقين من مختلف الدول العربية. من فضلك، هل صوتي مسموع؟ الصوت واضح؟
مسموع واضح دكتور، تفضل.
نعم. يعني موضوع الورقة كما تفضلت هو عن مصر والمصالحة، الآفاق والانعكاسات. وطبعا كان من الصعب جدا أن أتحدث عن الآفاق أنا أتحدث عن المصالحة أولا، ثم عن الآفاق والانعكاسات، قبل أن أتحدث عن جذور الأزمة نفسها، ويعني أين تقع مصر من هذه الأزمة. هل كانت طرفا فاعلا فيها منذ البداية؟ يعني كلنا نعرف أن مصر كانت موضوعا للأزمة، وأن الخلاف حول ما حدث في مصر، وخاصة يعني بعد 30 يونيو 2013 كان موضع خلاف مع يعني بين قطر وبين الدول التي فرضت عليها الحصار. لكن لماذا يعني تم الانتظار من 2013 عندما حدث التغيير وأتيح بحكم جماعة الإخوان المسلمين إلى عام 2017؟ ولذلك أنا كان لازم أتوقف عند يعني جذور
and to talk about the roots of such a crisis, because the crisis, in my view, is a GCC crisis. It is relevant to the GCC Council countries more than the relationship with Egypt. At the GCC Council, there were two trends. There was a cooperative trend that leads to integration, cooperation between the different countries akin to the unity in Europe. And also, there were crises that rose to the surface from time to time. Oftentimes, the GCC failed to solve these crises and problems. We do understand the level of interaction within the GCC for us to be able to understand what has happened, to understand the role of Egypt in such a crisis. That is why, at the beginning, I talked about why Egypt wasn't part in the decision that was undertaken to sever relations between Qatar and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and so on in 2014. So the ambassadors had been withdrawn for 9 months, and Egypt did not go into severing relations with the state of Qatar. So if the matter is a matter of position vis-à-vis the Egyptian revolution and the changes that have happened, why hasn't Egypt taken a position vis-à-vis what has happened? Because Egypt was in a transitional phase, and Egypt was almost under siege. It was in a position that would not enable it to sever relations with an Arab state. So it was trying to take all precautionary measures to stabilize its position internally. So, what is the real reason behind the crisis that erupted in 2017? In my view, the most important and dangerous factor that has happened at the international level was Trump becoming president of the United States, and there was another regional factor which is of no less importance, which is Mohammed bin Salman becoming crown prince of Saudi Arabia and the conflict in Yemen. So the relationship between Trump on the one hand and Mohammed bin Salman on the other hand, and Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed also, these were the factors. We can see that the crisis has only erupted after the visit that was carried out by Trump after the summit that took place and the escalation against Qatar. The decision was undertaken in Riyadh with the approval of Trump. So the regional context was the context that has led to the escalation of the crisis and the entry of Egypt into this equation, because the three countries knew that Trump had a vision vis-à-vis the liquidation of the Palestinian cause, and also to use the maximum sanctions, and these circumstances have contributed to the eruption and the deepening of the crisis. This is an unprecedented crisis in the GCC, and perhaps it is unprecedented in the Arab world at large. We haven't had such a crisis. We haven't had a case whereby an Arab country was treated in such a way. Yes, relations have been severed with Arab countries, but not blockades imposed as it was the case against the state of Qatar. So that is why, knowing the root causes of the crisis, the real reasons behind the crisis, was very important before we talk about reconciliation. I would like to move now to the reconciliation, and I hope I would have ample time to delineate the features of such reconciliation. So, why a reconciliation? So, this was a Saudi Arabian decision. The countries that have severed relations, they did not consult with each other to reconcile. In my personal view, the decision was a Saudi Arabian decision, and the entry of Saudi Arabia into this kind of exercise is what has led the other countries to enter into reconciliation as well. And this explains why we have had different speeds, paces when it comes to the reconciliation. The reconciliation between Egypt and Qatar was a bit slower than the one that was carried out between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, but it is still speedier, faster than the reconciliation between the Emirates and Bahrain. So the disagreements between the Emirates and Qatar are much deeper than the ones between Egypt and Qatar. So, what is the position of Egypt vis-à-vis the reconciliation? Of course, I talked about the reasons, and perhaps you can go back to the paper to know the details. But with regard to Egypt, there are 13 preconditions, but each country of the countries that have imposed the blockade have set these preconditions when it comes to the blockade. So for Egypt, there were two main things. So the relationship with Muslim Brotherhood and Al Jazeera, and the attack that used to be carried out or was said that Qatar was carrying out, or Al Jazeera was carrying out, it was inciting Arab nations against Egypt. So what has happened? Egypt was asking Qatar to sever relations with the Muslim Brotherhood and also to expel all Muslim Brotherhood figures and to hand over some persons that have been embroiled in terrorist acts, to hand them over to the Egyptian authorities. I do not think that the state of Qatar has responded to these demands. It was committed not to interfere in Egyptian affairs and not to use its territories to have Egyptian members who want to inflict harm on Egypt, but they have not handed over Muslim Brotherhood members that have been asked for by the Egyptian authorities. With regard to the Al Jazeera network, the demand that was made was the closure of Al Jazeera and the whole network of Al Jazeera. And as I said, most of these demands were not possible to achieve, and any country that wishes to preserve its sovereignty would not accept these conditions. But I think the statement, the Ula statement, and the beginning of negotiations between Egypt and Qatar about the conditions of reconciliation, we have seen a change in the way Al Jazeera network started covering the Egyptian scene, and this can be recognized by followers and viewers of Al Jazeera. So now Al Jazeera is keen not to go against its objectivity and also its professionalism in its editorial line. So on the bilateral level, we can see the direction of the reconciliation. So this decision was a Saudi Arabian decision, not a group decision. It was a decision made by Saudi Arabia and it was followed by the other countries. I do not think that the situation is going to go back to what it used to be before the crisis, but there is a process that has started with different speeds, and the bilateral relations between the countries that have imposed the blockade on the state of Qatar, this is going to take different forms in the Saudi Arabian case, the Emirati case, the Egyptian case, and the Bahraini case. But the question that we should pose now is this reconciliation is going to reinforce the GCC system and also the League of Arab States. I think that the root causes of these problems, whether within the GCC or within the regional system, these causes are very old and do two systems face structural problems. And if these structural problems are not solved, I do not think that this is going to have a clear impact on the development of the GCC in the future or the League of Arab States in the future. On the level of bilateral relations, the two countries have discovered at some point in time, they have discovered that there was a necessity to have a reconciliation, that there is a joint interest. For instance, the Renaissance Dam was one of the reasons, and we know that the League of Arab States Council have met in Qatar after the reconciliation, and they have undertaken the position to support the Egyptian and Sudanese positions. And this wouldn't have happened had the relationship remained as it was prior to reconciliation. Also, there is coordination between Egypt and Qatar in containing the crisis. So Egypt and Qatar are discovering prospects of developing relations in different fields. And also the factors of cooperation, conflict are there. But the GCC, I think, if we look into the prospects of reconciliation at the level of the GCC and the relationship with this council, I think that this matter needs to be looked at in a deeper way. In my personal view, in one phase or another, there was a belief that the relationship between the GCC countries, the similarity and affinity in terms of social structures and political structures, and the interrelationship between these different components. So they thought that they perhaps would be able to emulate the European Union experience, but this was not possible. It was not achieved. So the circumstances that have taken place have not enabled the countries of the GCC countries to achieve such objective. Yes, there are steps that have been undertaken. Yes, there are achievements that have been made. That is why the GCC Council needs to have a fresh vision that would take into account the variables, the changes, the transformations that have happened internationally and regionally if it wishes to come up with a new model of integration. And the relationship between Egypt and the GCC is going to remain an important relationship, a strategic relationship, but this relies on the role also that is going to be played by the GCC. It should have a clear vision, a specific vision when it comes to linking the security of the GCC with the Arab national security. And then the relationship between Egypt and the GCC can take a much larger dimensions. The League of Arab States is divided. It has the division within the GCC has weakened the League of Arab States, and the League of Arab States is in its weakest moments is the reconciliation going to positively impact the League of Arab States. The crisis with Qatar has deepened crises within the Arab world. That is why there is a new need at the level of the Arab countries to come up with a new vision that would set the source of threats for the Arab world, the source of threats for security threat for the GCC, and also to set the security of GCC countries and also the security of Arab countries. And this is a problematic that should be deeply studied in the future. I hope I was able to clarify the most important points that I have underlined in my paper, and I hope I have not gone beyond the time allocated to me in this session, and perhaps the points that have not been underlined would be underlined during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Nafaa, for this very nice briefing, and thank you for respecting the time limit. And I'm sure your intervention will raise questions, especially with the fact that many people are of the opinion that the reconciliation decision was a Saudi one, which was followed by other countries. Although Dr. Majid Al Ansari yesterday revealed that it was Egypt who started or initiated this process by offering to Egypt a visit, a secret visit by the Egyptian foreign minister. Anyway, our next speaker is Dr. Hassan AlHajj Ali, and Dr. Hassan is a professor of political science at Khartoum University. He was formerly Dean of College and the High Academy of Strategic Studies. And Dr. Hassan Haj Ali has become a member of the International Studies Journal, published by our center, and he has many publications to his name, and like the question of identity for youth in the Sudan in 2019. And in fact, he has been a long time associate of our center, and this morning we will give him 20 minutes to speak about the impact of the Gulf reconciliation on the rivalry dynamics in the Horn of Africa. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. I have a PowerPoint presentation to share with you, and my paper is on the impact of the Gulf reconciliation on the rivalry dynamics in the Horn of Africa, and takes into account the region of the Horn of Africa as one unit from the Horn of Africa to the Red Sea. And the Red Sea forms the center of this region. And this way, this definition will help us determine the main actors, and also to deal with the Red Sea area as a political unit. This is a map which reflects what I wanted to say, that this region forms one territory, and each part of it is impacted by other parts. And despite the fact that there was a lot of attention towards the area, the Horn of Africa, especially in the recent past, but the reconciliation of the impact of the Gulf reconciliation varies at the level of individual countries and the region as a whole. At the level of issues, there will be more attempts to establish military bases in the region. This was the basis of the rivalry and competition in the recent years, and the attention to political and economic matters will continue, of course. And the main reason for this kind of political attention is the presence of Iran, and therefore any impact of the Gulf reconciliation will be channeled towards facing up to the Iranian attempts to impose hegemony and expansion. As a matter of principle, we are talking here about Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who want to be centers of international commerce and trade. Somalia and Eritrea are important when it comes to the logistical aspects and supporting the ports. And Somalia, of course, is a cause of concern from a security point of view. And a number of studies, and this is supported by my paper, that see the Horn of Africa now as the peripherals of the Arabian Gulf, and which is becoming almost like borders as a result of the cultural, political, economic, and other aspects of exchange. There have been events, or three main events, in fact, in the past, which led to the countries in the Gulf being focusing their attention on Africa and the Horn of Africa. It started in 1914 with the discovery of oil and the desire to invest. Then there was the war in Yemen, and the countries in the Saudi-led coalition wanting some countries in Africa to join the fight with them, and also the crisis in the Gulf in 2017, which led to a very strong competition and rivalry between Gulf countries over the region of the Horn of Africa. There are three levels of interaction which impact the Horn of Africa. First of all, when we focus on the two biggest countries, Sudan and Ethiopia, after the fall of Bashir and Tigray regimes in these countries, and also the impact and the rivalry because of the war in Yemen, and also the rivalry and competition to establish military bases in the Horn of Africa. These are the three levels which impact the interaction between different countries over the Horn of Africa. It must be also mentioned that there's been changes in the Saudi and Emirati foreign policy, and the fear of Iranian expansion, especially after the agreement between Iran and Eritrea to use the military bases and ports. and also the tension between Eritrea and Ethiopia and the Jeddah agreement between the two countries, which was sponsored by Saudi Arabia. In addition, there is also a change in the Saudi foreign policy regarding military intervention, like what happened in Bahrain, then in Yemen. There's also the factor of the proxy wars, which Iran stood behind in a number of countries in the region, which led to a different realization of the requirements of national security. National security of Saudi Arabia and UAE. Also, there is another factor, and that is the former American President Trump's and looking at petrol as international public good, and also this is a table of the Gulf investments in the Horn of Africa in the period from 2000 to 2017, which involved Sudan, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, and the south of Sudan. We see that the main focus has been on Ethiopia. This is another cause for more interest in the current tension in Ethiopia, and the table reflects investments by the Gulf countries in the Horn of Africa. Now we will move to another important part of this paper, and that is what is variable and what is constant in the relations between Gulf countries and the Horn of Africa countries after the reconciliation. Of course, after the reconciliation, the situation has changed a little bit. We see in Sudan, in the Somalia, there is an involvement, and there is also bias towards this side of the Somali conflict or another. This is part and parcel of the usual pattern of intervention by foreign powers in the affairs of other countries. And what is noticeable, although, that the relations between Sudan with Qatar and Turkey have improved as a result of Al-Burhan's visit or visits. The paper expects that or forecasts that investment in the economy and in the logistical side will continue, and although the internal conflicts and trouble in Ethiopia and Sudan may be impacted by that, although by and large the investment movement seems to continue, Saudi Arabia is showing a growing interest in Africa, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is showing more interest specifically in the Horn of Africa region, and this is part of Saudi's National Vision 2030, and this involves West Africa, the Horn of Africa, Sudan. And what enhances this aspect is the change in the foreign policy of the UAE, as it is shown in some statements. They want zero problems, and the Washington Post said in an article by Bill Matthews that the UAE is focusing on economic investment and more than the military side, and this shows that after the withdrawal of the UAE forces from the war in Yemen, they dismantled the military base and also another military base in Barbara in Somalia, and other plans to expand military bases have been suspended. And also, uh, Turkey and Qatar have invested in the development of some ports, although the results were almost negligible. Now, the Red Sea of late has become the center of political and military competition between countries from within the region and outside it. And now we know that Israel was moved from the authority of the European American Command to the Central Command, which is responsible for the area, and also the Saudi desire to invest in Musawa and Asab ports after a visit to Eritrea, and this will enable the Saudis to link their ports with the ports in Pakistan and the Horn of Africa and be part of the Belt and the Road initiative. There's always been some military maneuvers late November 2021, and the desire by the Russians to establish military bases in Sudan, although the chairman of the Sovereign Council of Sudan has expressed some reservations, and also there was talk of Russians establishing a military base in Eritrea some 2 years ago, which was welcomed by the Eritrean government. The challenges now, first of all, the first important aspect here is the fragility of the area as a whole. There are now two countries which are the biggest, like Sudan and Ethiopia, facing internal problems, especially Ethiopia. Maybe it's expected that the country will be dismantled or disintegrated or maybe go through a period of instability. This is a country of 110 million population. This is bound to have an impact on the surrounding area and the Gulf countries. Secondly, the intensity of outside intervention. This map gives you examples of the drone air bases, the American bases, and we see the intensity of these bases in the Horn of Africa. They're keeping watch of what's happening in Somalia and in Yemen. This is another map of Djibouti and shows the military installations of a number of countries, including the original French base. There was an American base which was added, then a Japanese and some European bases. All of this is within this framework of outside intervention. The other challenge is the emerging countries like Turkey and India. They have huge investments. This is a map which shows what we call the land rush in Africa in the 21st century. And it shows that not only Gulf countries, there are other countries like India, South Korea, and Brazil. They all are clamoring over investing in land, in agricultural lands in Africa. this area has become very attractive and like a big magnet attracting attention from all over the world. In conclusion, the area of the Horn of Africa, so far as the relations with the Gulf countries, in this relationship, the Horn of Africa countries will always be following the Gulf countries. And secondly, there's a lot of interaction from the Red Sea to the Horn of Africa as a result of this intervention and rivalry. The political relations with outside countries shows there are proxies acting on behalf of other countries to expand their plans and competition. And finally, there is a lot of investment by the Saudis and Emiratis in the region, and there is a lot of also outside interest in military bases too. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you, Dr. Hassan, for this paper, and thank you for respecting the time limit. Especially you talked about an area which is very complex indeed when it comes to interaction. Now we open the floor to your questions and answers. Assalamu alaikum. So far as Dr. Hassan Nafaa, when I knew he is here, I came running because the last time I met him when he was invited to Al-Jazeera, you were Saad Hagras and Al-Jawad and Imad Din Hussein. I didn't believe him. I nominated him to be president, but he refused. Anyway, Egypt has nothing to do with Qatar. It's not Egypt. You must say the Sisi regime. Egypt has nothing to do with blockading. There is 350,000 Egyptians working in Qatar. They send back home 3-4 billion dollars. I've been here 28 years. I never had any problem. So please make a difference between Egypt and the Sisi. When the late Khashoggi, Jamal Khashoggi, was asked about the role of Egypt, he said, all what you have to do is send a check of $4 billion to Sisi, then the blockade would lifted. I don't know. I mean, Sisi has taken $100 million. We Egyptians are peaceful people, and Qatar as a country has been very good to us, and they said they used to say that Qatar is a little country. Qatar has proven it's a super country. They said Qatar is a little island. Qatar has proven it is a continent. Egypt is a great country. Egypt never hates anybody, never wants to impose blockades on anybody. We belong to the revolution. We are against the ruling regime, the coup makers and regime.
So Doctor
not
talked about
Egypt as a country. Dr. Dafur.
In the name of God, the most compassionate, my question is to Dr. Nafaa. How did you jump at the disagreement between Qatar and Egypt since the 90s? And the person that was sent by Egypt, the delegate that was sent by Egypt, the representative through Oman, and they wanted the meeting to be unofficial. How can you not underline these facts? Thank you very much to you all. My question is to Dr. Hassan Nafaa. Can we read this reconciliation as part the alliances that have been established, or do we see these alliances as a result of the reconciliation? So Egypt has regained its relations with Turkey, with Qatar, and the same, the Emirates has regained and resumed relations with Turkey. Can we read that as part of the repositioning of alliances, or on the contrary, the reconciliation is a prelude to the reconciliations that are taking place in the region? Is it going to lead to cooperation, or is it that friction is still taking place? Or are we going to see a new phase of new friction and new conflicts between the countries? Dr. Hassan mentioned and said that the crisis started with Trump, and he did not talk about the departure of Trump and the impact on the reconciliation. Go ahead. My question is Dr. Hassan Hajj Ali, in the light of the GCC investments in the Horn of Africa, how do you see the formation of alliances in the region, particularly with the presence of a regional and international powers? So what is the future of these formations? Go ahead. Thank you very much. My question is to Dr. Hassan Hajj Ali. How can you read the retreat of military bases in Djibouti and other countries in the region? Dr. Amal? My question is to Dr. Hassan Hajj Ali and the Omani colleagues. There was no mention of Oman with regard to what is happening in the Horn of Africa. This was the entry point of the influence of Oman in East Africa. So what is the position of Oman in such scene? Microphone, please. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you. My name is Maryam Al-Khater, specialized in political media. I would like to comment on what you said, and Dr. Hassan Nafaa yesterday took part in the discussion that took place in the opening session, and he mentioned and said that Egypt was not part in the first GCC crisis, and Egypt entered into the crisis since the siege that was imposed on the states of Qatar. My question is about the position of the GCC countries after the after the Arab Spring has waned, and also the transformation of positions and the change of positions after the Muslim Brotherhood came to power and Morsi becoming president. May God bless his soul. And after that, the beginning of the counter-revolutions. I think that the matter is not a GCC matter, concentrating on the blockade, particularly if we analyze and we move from the political reality, the virtual space, from the public space to the virtual space. We have seen in 2014 what has been the outcome of discussions on Twitter and the withdrawal of ambassadors. So Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the Emirates had not withdrawn its ambassador. So there was a headline saying, how is Egypt going to withdraw its ambassador? And the other headline said that Egypt is not going to make its ambassador return to Qatar. So we have seen what has happened. We have seen also in Western literature the arrival of Qatar to the doorstep of other countries, because there are some other countries who feared how the policy of Qatar has led to the fear getting closer to the doorstep of other GCC countries, particularly after the rise of Muslim Brotherhood. So there have been so many accusations that have been made, unfounded, baseless accusations have been made against the state of Qatar as sponsoring terrorism and so on. So also, this crisis is not only something that erupted as a result of what has happened in 2017, but also in 2014, particularly as a result of the counter-revolution and the revolution against the rule of Morsi, because they were designated as a terrorist group in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Dr. Hassan AlHajj about his paper on the Horn of Africa. Dr. Mariam, thank you very much. Dr. Hassan Nafaa, can you clarify and respond to the comments that have been made, particularly when you said that Egypt was not party to the conflict that took place in 2014? Mr. Saif, go ahead. Thank you very much. My question is to Dr. Hassan Nafaa. He said that Egypt in 2014 is not Egypt in 2017, but the relationship of Egypt with the Saudis and the Emiratis in 2017, their relationship then is different from what it is today. And this was due to this led, to a good relationship between Egypt and Qatar. There are some frictions with regard to the relationship between Egypt and the Emirates. The Emirates is supporting the Ethiopian government, and Egypt supports the Tigray movement. So my question to Dr. Hassan Nafaa, is there a difference between Egypt in 2017 when it took the decision with the 3 other GCC countries, and now? Is there a repositioning of Egypt in its foreign relations with GCC countries, or the situation is going to stay as it used to be? In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, first of all, my question is to Dr. Hassan AlHajj Ali. I listened to the analyses that were made. Everybody knows that there is no permanent enemy or friend in politics. So this is what is happening in the world of politics. Dr. Hassan AlHajj talked about the reorganization of the region, and particularly the containment of the Iranian policy in the region, and I do not know if there is an Israeli policy in the region that makes it necessary for Arab countries to contain it. So this is the first part. The second part, the arrangements in the region. We have seen that there are so many interests from great powers, but is this linked to the deal of the century that so many people talk about when it comes to international and local policies and what Israel is carrying out, the rapprochement that is taking place with Arab countries? So the reorganization, the rearrangement of things in the Arab region, is this going to lead to a deal over the century that would reform things in the region? May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Mahmoud Matar from Juan College. My question is to Dr. Hassan Nafaa. We carry out studies and analyses and we read the reality very well, but in the Arab studies, we have a weakness when it comes to future prospects. So the scenario that took place in the GCC, the blockade scenario, from the fluctuations in the strategic scene, do you think that such a scenario is going to take place again? What are the guarantees? I'm not talking about written guarantees among states. I'm talking about what is your view about the future of this region? Might there be new fluctuations, or the facts on the ground are not going to allow such a scenario to see light again? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So my question is to Mr. Hassan AlHajj Ali. I would like to look into relations between Egypt and the Emirates. And it seems to me that during the crisis since 2013, throughout the years until the reconciliation, Egypt at the beginning was closer to regional policies and the game of axes. And after that, it started regaining its position to become effective, active in regional relations to fill vacuums during that period. I think the exercise of looking at the relationship between Egypt and the Emirates would underline that in the Horn of Africa, in the East Mediterranean, in Libya, in Yemen. And it seems to me that the Emirates wouldn't have had a larger influence in the Horn of Africa without the vacuum that was left by Egypt. These regions, it seems to me, it is very difficult to understand the solutions of the Emirates and also the reason and the logic of this conflict and competition of crowns, and also the economic expansion, and also the support of the African American leadership. So it seems that there is a kind of an irrational will, and this seems to be the reason why we have such a thing. And Egypt has become closer to the influence of the Emirates.
الشد والجذب مع استعادة مصر لكثير من استقرارها الاقتصادي والسياسي.
So also Egypt has started finding in the influence and hegemony of the Emirates when it comes to the relationship of Emirates with Israel, and sometimes Egypt feeling a little bit embarrassed with regard to certain positions, and also the relationship with Turkey, the relationship with Libya, and even the solutions in Sudan. In Ethiopia, there is a clear problematic that the audience knows about when it comes to the role of the Emirates in supporting the Renaissance Dam. So if the view is from this narrow perspective, I call upon Dr. Hassan Nafaa and Dr. Hassan AlHajj Ali to answer kindly these two questions. Yes, go ahead. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. So my salutations to Dr. Hassan Nafaa. We have learned a great deal from him in Cairo through the different seminars by Dr. Ahmed Yusuf Ahmed. I have a question and a comment, as you wish. The role of the League of Arab States after reconciliation. Is it expected in the short term that the League of Arab States is going to exert strong efforts in reinforcing the Arab states? Is it possible for it to play such a role? Is the weakness of the League of Arab States is going to continue after the reconciliation? Also, there are differences of opinion. Is it a reconciliation? Is it a rapprochement? Is it going to be a prelude of good results that are going to lead to a real reconciliation in the near future? My question to Dr. Hassan Nafaa. Egypt was pioneering in the Arab states. You talk about Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. Now, three main roles have diminished, and we have only the role played by Saudi Arabia. When is Egypt going to come back again with its international, regional, and local law roles? So we'd like to listen to your opinion if in the very near future or medium or long-term future. My question is to Dr. Hassan AlHajj Ali. The African Union, what is the role of the African Union with regard to what is happening in the Horn of Africa? And what are the inputs that have been made during the GCC crisis? And is it possible, can they play a role in bringing the different parties together in their role? Please allow me to go back to the two researchers, Dr. Hassan Nafaa and Dr. Hajj Ali. We have only two papers and we have only up until 10:30. I would like to start with Dr. Hassan Nafaa. You have with you a number of questions, a number of comments. Go ahead. So I would like to thank all the colleagues. As I have said, there have been so many important matters that have been discussed, and commenting on this requires a lot of efforts. That is why I'm going to try as much as I can to answer the questions that have been made.
So far as the first question is concerned, the questioner said I was
ان كان في
jumping
خلافات بين
over
مصر
the facts
وقطر منذ معتصم
and there
الحضاري.
were differences between
اعتقد انه
Egypt and Qatar
يعني
since the
عندما
mid
تكون متاحه
90s.
لسيادتك قراءه الورقه ستجد
If
ان
you
لا شك
have
الى وجود
time
خلافات.
to read my
وأنا
paper in
كنت
full, you will
يعني
find that
كان في
I
مشاكل
have
حتى على
mentioned this,
مستوى
and there
دول مجلس التعاون
have
الخليجي.
been
وعندما
accesses
حدث
within the
مثلا
GCC.
اتهام
For
لبعض الدول
example, when some
بتدبير
countries
انقلاب قطر
were
والانقلاب
accused
في قطر
of
سنة
the
1996
attempted coup
كانت
d'etat in
مصر ما بين
Qatar in
الدول المتهمة، لكن
1996,
الذي اتهم
Egypt
أساسا
was
كان
one of
السعودية
the
والإمارات
countries
والبحرين.
who were
وهذا المحور
accused of
يعني
being
محور
involved,
الخلاف بين
although the prime
السعودية
suspect was
والإمارات
Saudi
والبحرين
Arabia.
هو محور التفاهم
And
له
so
جذور
this is
طويلة. وأنا
an
أعد
old story, and
إلى
it
هذا.
has its roots
لكن ده
in
ملوش علاقة
history,
بقضية
but
المواطنة.
has nothing to do
يعني ملوش علاقة مباشرة أقصد
or direct
بقضية الحصار على
relationship,
قطر،
at least
لأن
with the
الحصار على
question of
قطر
the
كان له
blockade
ممارسات
on
خاصة
Qatar,
تتعلق
because
بوضع
this
الدول
had
الإفريقية
its
والدعوات
own
والوضع الإقليمي من ناحية أخرى، لكن ما كانش له
dynamics,
علاقة
and it was
بقضية أو
not
تصحيح
based
حسابات
on
قديمة.
settling old scores
وقال
or
الدكتور
old
الأنصاري
disputes.
أن مصر هي
What
كانت
Dr.
الأولى
Al
في طلب
Ansari
المصالحة.
said
أنا
that
الحقيقة
Egypt
ليس لدي
was
معلومات
the
مؤكدة
first
حول هذا السؤال،
to
وأنا لا أعرف
initiate a
الحقيقة، فأنا
request
يعني
for
معلومات ليست موثقة، لكن
reconciliation. I have
من المؤكد أن
no
لدى الدكتور الأنصاري
idea. I'm not
ربما
privy to this
يعني معلومات
information.
حقيقية
I
في هذا
cannot
الشأن، لكن
base
السؤال
my
ليس
analysis
إذا كانت
on
مصر قد حاولت يعني
hearsay.
أن
Maybe
تتصالح مع
Dr.
قطر سابقا،
Ansari
لماذا
knows
فشلت هذه
better. So,
المحاولة؟
if there was an attempt
وبالتالي
by
الحقيقة يجب
Egypt
أن نلقي
to
عليه هي
reconciliate
هل
with
قبلت
Qatar, the question is why
مثلا،
was
يعني هل هي
why did the
ماذا
attempt
طلبت من
end
قطر
in
في هذه
failure?
الحالة؟
Did
هل هي
Egypt
موقفها من جماعة
ask
الإخوان المسلمين أو اتخاذ إجراءات
Qatar
معينة
to
ضد
change its position
الجزيرة،
vis-à-vis
ولا
the
استمرت،
Muslim
ولا هي كانت
Brotherhood or
مستعدة
Al Jazeera
لشيء آخر؟ يعني لا
media
توجد أي
network, or
تفاصيل حول
we
هذا
don't have
الموضوع.
any
وأنا
details
بقول
on
إنه
this.
يعني أؤكد قناعتي بأنه في نهاية
For me,
المطاف
I'm
ما
sure
حدث
that at the end
يمكن
of the day,
اعتباره
what
مصالحة
happened
حقيقية
cannot
بالمعنى
be considered
أن
as
الأطراف التي
a
خرجت في
real
حصار
reconciliation,
اجتمعت معا
because
وقررت
the countries who
المصالحة، لأنه
decided to impose a
القرار اتخذ
blockade
في
did not
السعودية
meet
وصدر
together
قرار في
and
السعودية
take a
بدليل أنه
joint decision. What happened
النواحي
was a
الإغاثية يعني كل
decision by
الدول
Saudi
على
Arabia,
حدة
announced in
تحدد
Saudi Arabia
يعني
by Saudi
تم تحديد
Arabia,
مبادئ عامة، لكن كل
although
الدول على
some
حدة
general
أن تحدد
principles
يعني
were
كيفية
determined, but it was
إجراء
left
المصالحة
up to
مع
each
قطر وفقا
individual
لسياق
country
العلاقات
to decide what to do
الثنائية.
so far as the
لكن
reconciliation with
السعودية
Qatar is
كانت هي الطرف
concerned,
الأساسي في الحصار،
within the context of that
ولم
country's
تكن مصر يعني
relations
حتى
with
لو
Qatar.
نظرنا إلى موضوع
Egypt,
تأثير
even if we
مصر
look
في
at
موضوع
this
الحصار،
matter
هو
from the
تأثير
point
محدود
of
في
view
واقع الأمر،
of
لأنه مصر
Egypt's
بعيدة
impact on the
جغرافيا.
blockade, this
مصر
has
لها
always been
عدد
very
كبير من
limited
المعارضين
because
في
Egypt is far
قطر، لها
away
مصالح
geographically,
كثيرة
and
في قطر،
Egypt has
وبالتالي
hundreds of thousands
يعني
of
التضرر
its
الشديد
citizens
للحصار
working in
حدث
Qatar and
أساسا
has
من
many
جانب
interests.
السعودية،
So
لأن المنفذ الحدودي الوحيد هو الذي يربط
the
بين قطر
damage inflicted on
والسعودية.
Qatar was
وبالتالي
done by Saudi Arabia
مصر كانت
mainly
يعني
because
أحد
of the
مسببات
direct
الأزمة كلها،
land
لم تكن
borders.
السبب الأساسي. وأنا
Egypt
شرحت
was
بهذا
one of
الطيات
the
وأرجو
causes
أنه
of
بس
the
حضراتكم
crisis, but not
يعني
the prime
لا
cause. And I have
تقرأوها إذا
explained
أتيحت لكم
this
الفرصة،
in my
لأن
paper. If you
الحصار
have
كله
time,
بقدر
please
ما هو
read it
حواري
in
في
full,
خلال ربع ساعة
because
أعتقد
many
هي
of your
مسألة
questions
صعبة
you will
جدا.
find answers for,
هل
because
يمكن
I was
قراءة
given
المصالحة
20 minutes only
بالاتفاقات
for this intervention and I can't
الإقليمية
cover
أم
everything,
هي نتيجة
obviously. The other question
للمصالحة؟ لا، أنا لا أعتقد أنه
about the
التحالفات الإقليمية التي
reconciliation
نشهدها حاليا ليست
and
نتيجة
its
للمصالحة، وتأثير
impact on the
المصالحة
current
عليها محدود في
alliances in
واقع
the
الأمر.
region. In
وكل
fact,
المنطقة
I don't
تعيد
think so.
يعني
The
تمركزها
entire region
وتعيد
is
حساباتها بعد
revisiting
رحيل
and
ترامب عن السلطة في
recalculating
واقع
after
الأمر،
the
لأن
departure of
هناك
Trump
تغيير كبير جدا
from the
حدث
White
في
House,
السياسة
because
الأمريكية
there's been a
عند
huge
مجيء ترامب.
change
وأنا شرحت
in the
أنه
American
يعني
foreign
دولة
policy
ترامب
when
لما
Trump came
فرض
to
الحصار
power.
بهذا الشكل
I have explained in my paper that if it wasn't for Trump's presence in the White House, the blockade wouldn't have been imposed on Qatar in the manner that it has been, and also when without the departure of Trump, the reconciliation process wouldn't have started, and even the summit in Al-Ula in Saudi Arabia, it was obvious that the participation of Kushner there was an indication that Trump had an interest to say that he helped or facilitated the reconciliation, and it's not Biden because he knew for sure that after losing the election, the reconciliation was bound to happen. There are other or many other questions. In fact, I don't have time to allude to all of them. Egypt in 2017 is not the same as Egypt in 2014. In 2014, Egypt was going through a transition, and there was still some sort of an agreement. There was reconciliation attempts on also the roadmap which was proposed on the 3rd of July indicated that after the deposition of the Muslim Brotherhood from power. So Egypt 2021 is very different than Egypt in 2017. Egypt was in a state of self-defense. They were trying to stabilize the country first before getting involved in any regional or international role. The regime was in a state of self-defense. They were trying to fend off a lot of attacks which came from all directions, could not have played a role regionally or internationally. Now, currently, Egypt is definitely restoring its position because who is ruling Egypt now is President Sisi, who rules with a vision different than the period of Nasser or Mubarak or Sadat. What will be the role of Egypt in the future? I don't really know, but it depends on three factors. First, the realization of the political leadership of what challenges and what opportunities are there. Secondly, the changes at the international level, and thirdly, the changes at the regional level, and there is continuous reaction, but this is a matter which we don't have time to delve into any details about. We always focus in our analyses on the current situation, but the future scenarios, of course, we don't pay much attention to sometimes. This is only natural in social sciences. Forecasting what can happen in the future is very limited. Even the United States itself, with all the think tanks and strategic centers, got involved in many wars and battles, but ended up in failure and defeat. So for the present, you have more data and more indicators. Of course, this should not stop us from trying to forecast the future, which is very important and remains so. So if the question by Mr. Mahmoud that can the scenario of the blockade on Qatar, can it be repeated? It's not necessarily necessary that the blockade would
لنفس
impose an
الأزمات
exact
المشابهة
same details and the same
لكن للأسف
crisis
الشديد أن الواقع
reoccurs.
الخارجي
But
مليء
unfortunately,
بالتناقضات التي يمكن
the
أن
current
تحدث مشكلات
reality in the
تسريبية
Gulf
أكثر
countries is full
والواقع
of
العربي كله مليء
contradictions,
بالتناقضات
and the
التي
Arab
يمكن أن تحدث
reality as a whole is full of
صراعات كثيرة في
contradictions
المستقبل
which can
وأنا
produce the kind
أتوقع
of
في جذور
conflicts
هذه
that we have
الصراعات
seen in the past
ونتائجها هيبقى من
and be
الصعب جدا
repeated
أن تحدث
in
نقلة
the
نوعية في
future.
العلاقات
It's difficult to
العربية
expect
يعني
a
العربية العربية على
dramatic
على
change
مستوى
in
العالم
the
ككل
inter-Arab
أو حتى في
relations at the
العلاقات
level of the
الخليجية
Arab
الخليجية
system
العربية
or
الخليجية
the intra-Gulf
إلى آخره
relations.
وأنا يعني من
I
الذين
personally
ولدت
of am of the
يعني
opinion
بعتبر
that
إنه مشكلة العالم العربي
the
الأساسية هي مشكلة النخب
prime
الحاكمة
problem in the Arab world is the
للأسف
problem
الشديد
with
إنه
the ruling elites.
يعني
Unfortunately,
أيا كان الأيديولوجية التي تطرحها أي نخبة حاكمة في العالم
whatever is the
العربي لن
ideology
تستطيع أي
that
نخبة حاكمة أن تحول
and
دولتها
these elites
لدولة
belong to,
مؤسسية
they did
وبالتالي ما
not
أنا
manage
بحتر
to
إليه هو
turn their
حقيقة
countries
يعني
or states
إمكانية أن تكون
into a
هناك
state
حكومات
built
عربية
on
تسمح بتداول
institutions and
السلطة يعني لا
institutionalization.
توجد فيها إمتلاكات
The,
لحقوق
and
الإنسان تكون
unfortunately,
جودة
there is
المؤسسات جودة
always
القانون
been
هذا هو ما
violations
يفتقر إليه
of human rights,
العالم
and
العربي
we
ولابد
lack
يعني لن
the
يستطيع أن
rule of
يحل
law.
مشاكله يعني
And for
عندما
this reason,
تحدث
we cannot
مشكلات
solve
دولية
our
ضد
problems.
الواقع
When we
العربي
have a problem,
غالبا تأخذ شكل شخص طابع شخصي
mainly
طابع
this
خلافات بين
problem
رؤساء دول
takes
رؤساء حكومات
the
وبيظهر
style of
البعد
dimension of
الأيديولوجي أو البعد
uh,
المصلحي إلى آخره
personal
وفق رؤية هذه
thinking and the
الحكومات
thinking of
لكن
the
لو في
elite and the
مؤسسة
vision
وهذه
of the
المؤسسات
elite
تعكس
and
إرادة الشعوب
individuals.
العربية أعتقد
If
أن
there were
العربية العربية
institutions
يمكن أن تدخل
reflecting
مرحلة نوعية ومختلفة
the desires and the
تماما
aspirations of the
ولا أدري
masses,
إذا كنت
I
تذكرت
think
طبعا
our
لازال
reality would
يعني
be
في أسئلة
different.
مهمة حوالين
There are many other important
دور
questions.
جامعة الدول العربية بعد
I
المصالحة
remember the one
أظن أنني
about the
أشرت إلى
role of
أنه
the Arab
يعني
League
موضوع
after
المصالحة
the
نفسه يعني طبعا
reconciliation. I think I
سيكون له
have
بعض
mentioned
التأثير على
that
أداء جامعة الدول
reconciliation
العربية
itself will have
لكن
an
في
impact
أثناء
on the performance
الحصار
of the
وأثناء
Arab League,
المقاطعات من
because
الصعب
during
جدا
the
أن
blockade it
تجمع
was
الدول
very
العربية
different
على كلمة سواء
to
سواء بالنسبة لهذه
bring
القضية
these
بموضوع قطر
countries
أو
together
بالنسبة
for
لأي أزمة
meetings, whether to do
أخرى
with Qatar or
لكن
any other
هل
crisis for
الخلافات
that
العربية
matter.
العربية اختفت؟ لا، موجودة
Solving
بشكل
the
أساسي. العالم
Arab
العربي
problems
يحتاج إلى معالجة
always
للانتماءات
helps. There are
الجنسية،
still many
يحتاج إلى
other
معالجة
problems.
لسوريا.
There is the
يعني
situation in
مثال
Syria,
عالمي من الجامعة
and
العربية حاليا
Syria now
أن
is
هناك
excluded
رؤية
from the
عربية
Arab
لكيفية
League.
استعادة سوريا إلى الجامعة
There should
العربية.
be a
هناك
united
الحل في
vision as
اليمن،
to how
لابد
to restore
من وضع حد
Syria.
للحرب في
There is
اليمن حتى
the war in
تستطيع
Yemen, which
اليمن أن
should
تلعب
be
دورها
brought into an
في
end
جامعة
so
الدول
that the
العربية.
Yemen can
هناك
play
الأزمة
its
في
role.
ليبيا إلى آخره.
There is a crisis
أزمات
in
كثيرة
Libya, and
جدا.
there are many
لماذا
other
نتمكن من
crises.
العثور على
And
حلول لهذه
unless we
الأزمات
find
لن تستطيع
solutions for
جامعة
these
الدول العربية
crises, the
أن تستعيد.
Arab
وفي
League
جميع
will not
الأحوال
be able to
كان دور جامعة
restore its
العربية جامعة الدول
role. And
العربية
in
كنظام
any
الفكر العربي
event, the
يعني
role of the Arab
دورها
League in
كان
the
مؤثر عندما كانت
Arab
مصر
regional
تقود العالم
system has
العربي في
been
مرحلة من
limited. There
المراحل
was a time when
وخاصة
Egypt
عندما كانت
used to
تتبنى
lead,
الصعوبة
when
تتبنى
Egypt
الأيديولوجية
used to adopt
القومية. وأنا كنت
pan-Arabism and
بشرف
Arab
أن معهد
nationalism and
معهد
this kind
السلام
of
مع
ideology.
إسرائيل
Now
يلاقي دول
Egypt
عربية أخرى
has a
تزايد على
peace
الموقف العربي.
treaty with
وبالنسبة للإخوة اللي طرحوا
Israel,
موضوع
and
الإمارات الحقيقة
for
إنه
those who asked about the
مشكلة
UAE,
يعني أنا أتوقع إنه إذا
I
استمرت
expect
الإمارات في
that if
سياستها
the
الحالية
UAE
ستظهر
continues on the
مشكلات
path
كثيرة
it's been
في
following,
المستقبل.
we'll
يعني
expect
لا
more
أدري
problems
المشروعات
in
اللي
the
بتطرحها
future.
الإمارات مع
I
بعض
don't
الدول
know.
زي
These projects that
تركيا
the
على سبيل المثال،
Emirate is
وهناك
proposing
حديث
with
عن
countries
نقل
like Turkey,
البضائع
for
مباشرة
example,
إلى تركيا
like
ومرورها
moving
إلى
goods
أوروبا عبر خط
directly
يعني من
to
حلب،
Turkey
وبالتالي لا
and
تمر
then
على قناة
taking
السويس
them
أو بعض
directly to
المشروعات
Europe,
المتعلقة
bypassing the Suez Canal.
ب يعني
Also,
تنمية
other
العلاقات
projects
مع
on developing
إسرائيل
relations with
يمكن أن
Israel.
تؤثر تأثيرا كبيرا على مصر لكن
This
طبعا
can
مصر
have a huge
تتحدث عن هذه
impact
المشكلات
on Egypt.
بشكل
Of
مفتوح.
course,
لكن إذا
Egypt does
صح
not talk about
إنه
these problems
الموقف
openly.
الإيراني يعني في اتجاه
But
التطبيع مع إسرائيل بهذه الطريقة
if the
وإتاحة
Emiratis
الصراعات
move
والتوسع
in the
والمساواة
direction
في
of
مستقبليا
normalization
بالتأكيد العلاقات بين
and they
الإمارات
keep on
ومصر ستتأثر
proposing
كثيرا
projects of this
بهذا.
kind that have an
أعتقد
impact
أنني
on
أطلت
Egypt,
أكثر من
I'm
اللازم،
sure
لكن أنا
Egypt will
تحت أمر حضرتك وإذا
respond.
أرسلت مرة أخرى
I'm
وإذا كان
sorry if
هناك
I've taken
يعني
too much of your time,
موضوع
but
لم
I'm
أجب عنه
ready.
أرجو نظرا
If I
للأستاذ.
didn't
شكرا
answer
جزيلا.
all your questions, please let
شكرا
me know.
جزيلا
Thank you
دكتور.
very much, Dr.
خلينا
Hassan
ننتقل
Naf'a.
للدكتور حسن الحاج علي أيضا
Let's move to Dr.
يأخذ
Hassan
دورة في
AlHajj
التفاعل مع التعقيبات
Ali
والمسائل
to give
والإشكالات.
him the
شكرا
opportunity
دكتور
to
حسن لك
respond
الكلمة.
to his questions and comments on his
شكرا جزيلا
presentation.
للإخوة الذين
Thank you very much for all those who asked questions or made comments. I too will be quick. I will try to give brief answers to the questions which were raised and which pertain to my presentation and focus on the situation in the Horn of Africa, of course. You know, these alliances can shift and change. Even in 2018, Eritrea, which signed an agreement to use its seaports, but afterwards Saudi Arabia and the UAE of implementing the peace agreement in Jeddah between Eritrea and Ethiopia, there was a shift. Iran left the port in Eritrea, and also also there is a lot of talk about what made all these countries invest in the Horn of Africa or establish military bases, which always have an impact on the situation. And also in Somalia, for example, the Al-Shabaab movement, which has expanded into Kenya and Guinea, and also the safety of the sea lanes, the presence of pirates in the Horn of Africa, also the impact of the war in Yemen. All these are factors which can work together and make countries want to be involved, and we must not forget the trade, the movement of goods coming from East Asia and go through the Bab el-Mandab gateway, and the reasons which made some Gulf countries to withdraw or to change their military position, especially the UAE, who declared that they withdrew from the war in Yemen. And even the Emirati facilities in Eritrea, which were used to transfer Sudanese troops, especially the rapid intervention forces, when they were transferred to Yemen, they used to go through these UAE facilities in Eritrea. There is, so far as Oman is concerned, the strong relations of Oman with Tanzania, Kenya, and Zanzibar, more than the Horn of Africa, and they have no parallel presence parallel to the Saudi or Emirati in the area of Djibouti, Ethiopia, or Sudan in comparison. There was a question regarding Israel. Israel in the past used to show a lot of interest in the basin of the Nile, and
بصورة مباشرة
they wanted to impact directly on Egypt. They had strong relations with Ethiopia, regardless of the nature of the systems ruling or the regimes ruling in Ethiopia. And also when the Falasha Jews
حتى هذه اللحظة
were
توجد
transferred
أنه
to
من أحد الناس
Israel,
الذين ينتظرون
there are
التأهيل
still
إلى
some people till
إسرائيل
today in camps who claim to belong to the Falasha Jews, and they
وإسرائيل
want to
نفسها أيضا
be
موجودة شاركت
repatriated
مؤخرا
to
معنا
Israel.
في مناورات في البحر الأحمر
Israel recently took
أعقب
part in
مرورها
maneuvers
قبل
in the
أسبوع
Red Sea,
بين
maybe a week ago, in fact,
بالمشاركة مع الولايات المتحدة
and
الأمريكية
participation with the
والبحرين
United
والإمارات
States, Bahrain, and the UAE.
أنا لا أتفق مع
I
الزعيم
disagree with the
الرأي الذي
opinion that
ذكره
says
الأستاذ عبدو
that,
في
which
ما
was
يتعلق
in fact
بالدافع
expressed by
الرئيسي
Mr. Abdu, that the main
للوجود
motive
الإماراتي
behind the
الاقتصادي الكبير
UAE's
في منطقة
presence
الغرب هو انحسار الوجود المصري
economically is
وبالتالي لا نستطيع أن
because
نتجه
Egypt's influence has
كل
retracted.
هذا الوجود
In fact,
بعد سلبي اللي هو انحسار
we
الوجود قد
cannot
يكون صحيح
just
انحسار للوجود
look
المصري
at this
لكن
the UAE presence as simply as
مصلحة الإمارات
a
والإمارات
result of
يجب أن نعرف أن لديها فرصة
Egypt's
في مجال
attraction.
اللوجستيك
The
في مجال
UAE has
المطارات
always
لديها
been
قدرات
interested.
تستطيع أن تتطور
They
كثيرا
wanted a
لكن
logistical
موارد
base.
الدولة
They
لديها
invested
تدير
not in
موانئ
this area.
مختلفة من دول في العالم
They run many ports in different
وبالتالي
parts of the
هذا
world.
ينطلق من
And therefore,
أهداف
I think
ومصالح
this
ذاتية
emanates from
إماراتية تريد أن تعزز
self-interests and
وجودها
reasons
في
to
مجال
do with the UAE
العمل
wanting
اللوجستي
to enhance
وعمل إدارة الموانئ في
its
دول العالم.
work and its interest
هناك
in
سؤال عن دور
running
الاتحاد الأفريقي
these sports. There
في
was a
منطقة الغرب.
question
الاتحاد الأفريقي
on the role
لديه
of
دور
the
مؤثر
African
في
Union.
السودان يعني
The
الاتفاق بين
African
الدول العسكري
Union
والقومي
plays
الذي
an important
تم
role in Sudan.
بمبادرة من
We
الاتحاد الأفريقي.
appreciate the
الاتحاد
role.
الأفريقي
The
أيضا
agreement
يسعى
with some
لإيجاد
military
حل
factions and the
للنزاع
government was
الداخلي
sponsored
في إثيوبيا.
by the African
الرئيس
Union. Now,
النيجيري الأسبق أوباسانجو يتحرك في هذا
Obasanjo, the
المجال
former
ويتحدى
president of
روسيا
Nigeria,
في
is
محاولة
mediating in
للتوصل
Ethiopia.
لإنهاء
They are
القتال الداخلي في
trying to end the
إثيوبيا.
fighting in
يبدو أنه أيضا
Ethiopia.
لا يزيدنا نكتفي بهذا
I think this is what the time allows me to comment. Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan. I'm sure many will be interested in reading your paper in full and Dr. Hassan Nafa's paper in full. Anyway, they'll be included in the book which will be published. I wished we have more time to take another round of questions, but the time is over for this session. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Dr. Hassan Nafa. Thank you, Dr. Hassan AlHajj Ali. We have been honored by your presence. We have a break of 15 minutes. We will resume at 10:45 to start the second session of today. Thank you and God bless.